The snow was silent that night, until Officer Ethan's flashlight caught something strange, a patch of ice disturbed as if hiding a secret. He knelt, his gloved hands scraping against frozen ground, and then he saw it, a muzzle, frostbitten, barely moving, a German shepherd buried alive. For 3 years, Ethan believed his partner was gone, lost to the fire and swallowed by the past. But what he uncovered in that storm was more than survival. It was a miracle that would test loyalty, faith, and the power of love that refuses to die. What happened next will shake your heart and remind you that sometimes God's greatest signs walk on 4 legs. The shoreline of Lake Michigan was shrouded in a suffocating veil of fog that night, the kind that swallowed every shape and blurred the line between water and land. The lake itself seemed endless, a slab of black glass barely touched by the moonlight, with the mist rising in silent plumes. The November cold pressed down like an invisible weight, seeping through every layer of clothing, crawling beneath the skin until it stiffened the bones. Waves lapped quietly at the sand, their rhythm muted by the fog, as though nature itself dared not disturb the silence. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, mixed with the dampness of wet earth, and somewhere far off a buoy bell tolled, mournful and hollow, then vanished into the haze. Ethan Brooks had long since stopped being unnerved by nights like this, but they never stopped reminding him of everything he had lost. At 35, he was still considered young by his colleagues. Yet the weathered lines carved along the edges of his mouth and the faint shadows beneath his gray-green eyes told another story. Ethan worked as a rescue officer for the county's lake patrol, a job that kept him tied to Michigan's unpredictable waters year-round. His broad frame carried the strength of years, hauling people from wrecks and rivers, but his movements had slowed slightly over time, as if each memory added an invisible weight to his steps. His dark brown hair, once thick and unruly, was now trimmed short for practicality, flecked at the temples with early strands of gray. He had a square jaw dusted with perpetual stubble, a detail less about style and more about exhaustion. His colleagues often described him as dependable but distant, a man who kept his words as brief as his smiles, but those who knew him well understood the reason. 3 years earlier, on a night as unforgiving as this one, Ethan had lost something no uniform could replace. He trudged along the sand, his boots sinking into the damp surface with each step. The beam of his flashlight cut a narrow path through the fog, bouncing off driftwood, half-buried rocks, and the occasional scrap of litter washed up from the lake. Nights like this were the loneliest, with only the crunch of his boots and the muted roar of the waves to remind him he wasn't swallowed whole by silence. Still, duty was duty. The Weather Service had issued warnings about a cold front sweeping through the area, and Ethan's orders were simple. Sweep the shoreline, check for stranded motorists or boaters, and make sure no one was foolish enough to brave the lake at this hour. His hand tightened on the flashlight when something caught his eye. A few yards ahead, the fog thinned enough for him to notice an odd disturbance in the sand. At first it seemed like nothing more than uneven ground, the kind of shifting dunes that changed shape with every storm. But as he drew closer, Ethan realized this was different. The sand was pressed down in rough streaks, dragging marks that led from the tree line toward the water. They were too deliberate, too uneven, as if something or someone had been pulled across the ground. His gut clenched. Ethan crouched low, sweeping the beam of light across the surface. The sand was darkened in patches, the marks irregular. He touched it with a gloved hand. The grains were still damp, as though disturbed recently. His breath condensed into a thick cloud before his face, and his heart hammered harder than the stillness around him warranted. Training and instinct converged in a single thought. Something was buried here. The idea alone twisted his stomach. Burials in sand often meant desperation, animals, crime, or something too cruel to name. With stiff fingers, he began clawing at the mound, scooping handfuls of cold sand. At first it yielded nothing but packed grit and the sharp sting of pebbles, but then his knuckles brushed something coarse. He froze, his breath catching. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand as he dug deeper, faster now, driven by a rush he couldn't explain. More sand gave way, and then suddenly a patch of fur appeared. Ethan's chest seized. He pushed harder, clearing the surface until a muzzle emerged, cracked and stiff with frost. The nose twitched faintly, just enough to release a weak puff of steam into the night air. Alive, against every shred of logic, whatever was buried here was alive. Ethan's voice cracked as he muttered a hoarse reassurance, though to whom, himself or the creature, he wasn't sure. He cleared more, unearthing a head, a pair of ears pinned back, eyes half shut and glazed over with a dull amber sheen. The recognition hit him like a gunshot. That scar, just above the left ear, jagged and unmistakable. Those eyes, dim now but still carrying a stubborn glint of fire. His throat closed as he whispered the name he had not dared speak in years. Shadow. The German shepherd stirred weakly at the sound, a faint tremor in his body as if he recognized the voice. His coat, once thick and sable black with streaks of tan, was now patchy and matted with grime, his ribs jutting sharply against the skin. He looked older than Ethan remembered, the proud, muscular frame now reduced to a frail shadow of itself. But he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, Shadow had survived. Ethan's eyes blurred, and his breath shook as he slid his arms beneath the battered frame. The dog was lighter than he should have been, too light for an animal once strong enough to pull men from water and leap over barricades. The weight was wrong, the frailty sickening, yet the rise and fall of Shadow's chest told Ethan what his heart already knew. His partner hadn't given up. The memories crashed down harder than the waves behind him. 3 years ago, on a storm-torn night, they had responded to a capsized vessel near the river mouth. Fire had broken out on the deck, the chaos swallowing everything. Ethan had been struck by falling debris, his last memory the fierce barking of Shadow before the water and smoke took everything. When he woke in a hospital bed days later, the report was simple. The dog hadn't made it. For years, Ethan carried that loss as both wound and penance, believing he had failed the only partner who had never abandoned him. And now here he was, trembling but breathing, staring up at him from beneath the sand. Ethan clutched the shepherd close, his lips pressed against the damp fur. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice raw. "I swear I've got you this time." The fog curled tighter around them, muffling the world until there was nothing left but the sound of Shadow's shallow breaths and the pounding of Ethan's heart. The night, once suffocating with silence, now pulsed with something new, something that felt like the first flicker of hope in years. Ethan staggered up the narrow street with Shadow clutched in his arms, the fog trailing behind him, as if reluctant to let them go. The small town of Marquette, pressed against the shore of Lake Michigan, was silent at this late hour. The lamps along the street glowed with weak halos in the mist, barely enough to guide his way, but Ethan knew where he needed to be. At the end of the block stood the Pine Harbor Veterinary Clinic, its modest brick building softened by frost clinging to the windows. A single porch light glowed above the entrance, casting a pale circle on the steps. He kicked the door with his boot, fumbling for the handle until it yielded. Warmth hit him instantly, the kind that smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with hay, the lingering scents of medicine and animals. Inside, the lobby was quiet. Worn chairs lined the wall, a faded bulletin board plastered with lost pet flyers, and a counter stacked with paperwork. Behind it sat a woman who looked up in startled shock. Grace Miller rose so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. She was 32, tall and slender with an angular build that carried a kind of determined grace. Her long hair, a cascade of auburn tied hurriedly at the back, caught the overhead light with copper glints. Her skin was pale from long hours under fluorescent bulbs, but her eyes, hazel flecked with gold, were sharp, alert, and softened only when speaking to her patients. She wore navy scrubs under a gray cardigan, sleeves pushed up to her elbows, as if she had been caught mid-shift. Grace had grown up in this town, left for veterinary school, then returned after her father's sudden death. That loss had carved something in her, making her cautious with people but fiercely protective of the creatures that depended on her. What happened? Her voice broke the stillness as she rushed around the counter. Ethan's jaw tightened. Found him in the sand. Buried. He's still breathing. Grace's hand hovered near Shadow's side, her practiced eye catching the tremors, the shallow breaths. Bring him in. Now. She pushed open the swinging door that led to the treatment rooms, guiding Ethan with brisk urgency. The room smelled sharper than the lobby, stainless steel counters gleaming, cabinets lined with supplies. A metal examination table stood at the center, under a lamp that burned white and unforgiving. Ethan laid Shadow down gently, pulling his coat tighter around the trembling body until Grace stripped it away. A second figure entered, drawn by Grace's call. Alex, IV line, heated blankets, let's go. Alex Carter, the clinic's assistant, was 23, lean and wiry, with sandy blonde hair cut close at the sides and a few stubborn strands falling into his forehead. His round glasses slipped as he hurried, his blue scrubs wrinkled as if he had been dozing in the break room. Despite his youth, his movements were quick and efficient, a sign of nights spent in constant emergencies. Alex had grown up working at his uncle's farm, which had left him both compassionate and hardened. The sight of suffering animals had always stirred something he couldn't ignore. Shadow's chest rose and fell erratically. His muzzle was cracked, his paws crusted with frost, patches of fur rubbed raw. Grace's brow furrowed as she ran her hands gently along his ribs, noting how sharply they jutted. Malnourished. Severe dehydration. He's been through hell. Alex slid an IV needle with practiced ease into the vein of Shadow's front leg, his hands steady despite the tension. Clear fluid began to drip slowly down the line. Grace retrieved warm saline packs from a nearby cabinet, layering them along the shepherd's torso. Alex fetched blankets from a dryer unit, heat radiating from the fabric as he draped them carefully across the dog's frail frame. Ethan stood frozen beside the table, his tall figure hunched, his gloved hands curling against his sides. His storm-gray eyes never left Shadow, fear and hope tangled in equal measure. He felt as if the entire world narrowed to each shallow breath, each twitch of a paw. He's fighting, Grace murmured, her eyes flicking to Ethan. Dogs don't fight unless they still want to live. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat raw. He always fought, more than anyone I've ever known. Shadow stirred faintly, his eyes fluttering open. Amber, dulled by exhaustion, met Ethan's gaze. For the briefest second, recognition lit there. fragile but undeniable. The shepherd let out a ragged whimper and nudged his muzzle weakly against Ethan's hand. Ethan bent close, pressing his forehead against the damp fur. "I've got you, partner," he whispered, voice breaking. "I'm not losing you again." Grace paused, her hands stilling as she watched the exchange. For years she had witnessed bonds between people and animals, but rarely something like this. An unspoken tether that had survived fire, distance, and cruelty. Alex, too, slowed in his movements, his expression softened by awe. "Whatever he's been through," Grace said softly, "he held on for you." Shadow shifted under the blankets, a faint tremor rippling through his battered body. His breathing was uneven, but it carried a stubborn rhythm. Ethan stroked the scar above his ear, the one mark that had survived unchanged. Grace adjusted the IV line, her voice firm once more. "We keep him warm. We keep him hydrated. That's all we can do tonight." Ethan nodded, jaw tight, though his eyes glistened. He refused to move from Shadow's side, even as the hours stretched into silence. The storm outside rattled the clinic windows, but inside, beneath the sterile light, 3 people bent over one broken dog. In that fragile circle, for the first time in years, Ethan felt the faint spark of hope flicker alive. The clinic's fluorescent light hummed faintly, a quiet counterpoint to the storm still lashing outside. Ethan sat in a hard-backed chair pressed against the wall of the treatment room, his tall frame bent forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the German shepherd lying swaddled in warmed blankets. Shadow's chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath shallow but stubborn, a rhythm that drew Ethan into a trance of memory and dread. His gloved hand hovered over the dog's scarred head, occasionally brushing gently against the coarse fur, as if afraid any harder touch might shatter the fragile thread of life still clinging there. For a moment, the room blurred. The antiseptic tang in the air gave way to smoke, acrid and biting. The hum of the heater dissolved into the roar of fire. Ethan blinked hard, but the memory pushed through, pulling him back 3 years to the night that had carved the hollow inside him. The fire had broken out on a rusted vessel moored near the southern docks, an old cargo boat used illegally by drifters. Rumors had spread about people living aboard, desperate families seeking shelter, and Ethan, then only 32, was among the first responders. He remembered the stench of diesel fuel thick on the water, the flames snapping through wooden beams like dry kindling. The night had been pitch black except for the inferno, reflected in the churning water like shards of molten glass. Beside him had been Shadow, then in the prime of his strength. The German shepherd was 4 years old at the time, his sable coat sleek and his body muscular, trained for both search and rescue and law enforcement support. Shadow had a keen, commanding presence, standing nearly 2 feet at the shoulder, with sharp, amber eyes that seemed to weigh the world. He was known among the crew for his quiet focus, a dog that rarely barked without cause. But when he did, his voice cut through chaos like a blade. That night, the dog had barked furiously, tugging at his handler's sleeve, urging him forward into the smoke. Ethan had trusted him without hesitation, following the shepherd across broken planks and searing heat. They had found people inside, half-conscious from the smoke, and dragged them toward the deck. Ethan had pushed one man out the hatch, coughing hard, just as the ceiling cracked above. He remembered the thunder of collapsing beams, the sudden wave of fire swallowing the corridor, and then darkness. His last memory before waking in the hospital had been the sound of Shadow barking, fierce and unyielding, until the roar of flames drowned it out. When he woke, battered and bruised, They told him no trace of the dog had been found. Gone, they had said. Ethan carried that loss like a stone, a failure that reshaped him. Friends noticed how he withdrew. Once sociable, always ready with a crooked smile or a dry joke, he grew quieter. His jawline became more severe, always set tight. The faint laugh lines around his mouth hardened into shadows. His colleagues respected him, but they whispered he carried storms in his chest. They were right. Now, 3 years later, here Shadow lay again, emaciated, scarred, but alive. The bond had not snapped. It had stretched across years of grief and cruelty, and somehow endured. Ethan pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's, closing his eyes, letting the present mingle with the memory until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. A quiet sound drew him back. Grace Miller stepped softly into the room, carrying a clipboard against her side. Her auburn hair had fallen loose from its knot, framing her tired but resolute face. She watched Ethan for a moment before speaking, her tone measured. His vitals are holding, weak but steady. Ethan exhaled, a sound caught between relief and fear. That's more than I thought I'd get tonight. Grace moved closer, checking the IV drip with practiced fingers. He's endured more than I'd expect from any animal. Whatever happened to him, someone didn't just abandon him. They tried to break him. The words struck a nerve. Ethan's hands curled into fists on his knees, knuckles whitening beneath the gloves. He remembered the drag marks in the sand, the way Shadow's body had been buried deliberately. It wasn't chance. Someone had done this. Grace noticed his silence, her hazel eyes softening slightly. You know him well, don't you? Ethan's jaw tightened, his voice low. He's not just a dog. He's my partner. He paused, glancing down at the shepherd's scar. 3 years ago, I thought I lost him in a fire. I believed it every day since. And now... His throat closed. Grace laid the clipboard on the counter, folding her arms. Sometimes the world takes things from us only to hand them back later. Broken, but not gone. Ethan met her gaze briefly, something like gratitude flickering in his storm-gray eyes, though he quickly looked back to Shadow. If someone did this, I'll find out who. The door opened again, and Alex Carter leaned in, his blonde hair sticking damp to his forehead from exertion. He carried a tray of instruments, his round glasses slipping again as he spoke. We'll need to monitor him all night. His temperature's still low, but it's rising. Ethan gave a brief nod. He wasn't leaving anyway. The hours stretched, the storm outside battering against the windows. Ethan's mind wandered back and forth, from the blaze of memory to the fragile breath before him. He saw Shadow leaping through smoke, teeth bared against fear, then saw him now, weak but still pushing his muzzle against his palm. It was the same dog. The bond hadn't broken, only been tested. At some point, Ethan rose from his chair and paced the room, his tall silhouette cutting shadows against the wall. He couldn't shake the question. Who had kept Shadow alive only to torture him? What kind of cruelty left scars? Like these? The thought gnawed at him until his resolve hardened. This wasn't just about rescue anymore. It was about justice. As dawn began to push faint gray light against the clinic's frosted windows, Shadow shifted under the blankets. His amber eyes opened again, clearer this time, locking onto Ethan's. The shepherd let out a soft, raspy whine and nudged his head weakly toward the man. Ethan leaned close, his voice steady but tender. I'm here, boy. I never stopped looking for you. The bond was alive. And for the first time since that night of fire, Ethan felt more than grief. He felt purpose again. By the time the storm cleared, the town of Marquette lay muted beneath a crust of snow and silence. Dawn had arrived pale and brittle, the lake's horizon blurred with lingering mist, but inside Ethan Brooks carried a storm of his own. He had stayed at Shadow's side through the night, watching every breath, every twitch of recognition, until exhaustion dragged him into brief lapses of sleep in the chair. When Grace entered at first light, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and the same weary determination etched into her features, she found him still there, hand resting protectively on the shepherd's scarred head. Grace had learned something in her years of practice. Animals sometimes spoke more through their silence than people did through words. And Ethan, for all his stoic posture, was clearly listening to the silence of this dog more than he had listened to anyone in years. She set the coffee down gently and cleared her throat. "I know someone you might want to talk to," she said. Ethan's eyes lifted, wary. "Who?" "There's an old trapper who lives near the northern ridge," Grace explained. "Name's Walter Dempsey. He's been in these woods longer than any of us. People say he knows the tracks of every animal, the footprints of every man. If there's been someone dragging cages through the pines, he would have seen it." Later that day, bundled against the biting cold, Ethan drove the county SUV up toward the ridge. Shadow rode in the back seat, weak but alert, his ribs wrapped in fresh bandages, his amber eyes following every sway of the trees beyond the frosted glass. Grace sat in the passenger seat, auburn hair pulled into a tighter knot, her cardigan replaced with a thick wool coat. She held a map on her lap, though Ethan knew she didn't need it. Locals grew up navigating these woods by memory. The cabin of Walter Dempsey appeared after a long ascent, a squat structure of hand-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather, its chimney coughing faint threads of smoke into the crisp morning. Outside, a figure split wood with slow precision. Walter was in his late 60s, a tall man who had once carried the bulk of a lumberjack, but was now wiry with age. His face was leathery from winters spent outdoors, his jawline strong though softened by a week's worth of silver stubble. His eyes were a sharp blue, steady and unsettling, the kind that measured a man in silence before ever speaking. He set the axe aside when the SUV crunched to a stop. "Sheriff's boy," he greeted, his voice roughened by tobacco and age. "Didn't expect to see you up here." Ethan nodded stiffly, the old title lingering even though his father had been gone for years. "Need your eyes on something, Walter?" Inside, the trapper's cabin was as sparse as the man himself. Antlers mounted above the hearth, pelts draped across beams, and shelves cluttered with jars of preserved food. A hunting rifle leaned against the doorframe. Grace kept her coat on, shifting uneasily in the rustic gloom, but Walter moved with ease, pouring black coffee into enamel mugs. "You're not here for pleasantries," he said, handing one to Ethan. "So tell me why you brought a wounded dog and a tired woman into my home." Ethan explained, voice steady but edged with steel, recounting the drag marks in the sand, the chains, and the cages. Shadow lifted his head at the mention, a low growl vibrating through the silence as though confirming every word. Walter's expression darkened as he listened, setting the mug aside. "3 nights ago," the old man said finally, "I saw lantern light moving through the pines east of the creek bed. Not hunters. Too many shadows. Too much noise. They hauled something heavy. I could hear the chains clinking even through the snow." His blue eyes locked on Ethan. "You'll find your devils there." Hours later, Ethan and Grace moved quietly through the pines, Shadow padding beside them, each step slow but deliberate. The forest was a cathedral of silence, branches bowed with snow, the air sharp with pine resin. The further they went, the more the trail revealed itself. Boot prints pressed deep into the frozen earth, tire grooves half covered by drifts, and finally, scraps of burlap snagged on branches. Then the cabin appeared, half collapsed, slouched beneath the weight of neglect and snow, its crooked chimney leaning like a broken tooth. A faint orange glow flickered through cracks in the warped boards. Grace's breath caught. They're here. Even before they reached the wall of the cabin, the sound confirmed it. The muffled chorus of dogs, barking hoarse, claws scraping metal. Shadow stiffened, ears pricked, a growl rolling through his throat. He strained forward against Ethan's grip, his battered body trembling but unwilling to stay still. Ethan crouched low, his broad shoulders tense, service pistol drawn. His gray-green eyes scanned the perimeter with soldier's focus, every muscle taut with the memory of fire and loss. He turned to Grace, who carried nothing more than a flashlight, and the stubbornness of someone unwilling to leave him alone. "Stay close," he whispered. They crept to the side of the cabin, peering through a gap in the boards. Inside, the sight froze them both. Rows of cages stacked crudely, iron bars rusted but solid, each holding a dog. Some were small terriers whimpering pitifully, others larger breeds pacing in agitation, their eyes wide and desperate. The smell of filth and fear leaked through the cracks, clawing at the back of Ethan's throat. Suddenly, movement. Shadows detached themselves from the cabin walls, two men in heavy coats stepping out into the snow, rifles slung casually across their backs. One was tall, bearded, his broad chest straining against the seams of his coat. The other shorter, stockier, with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, the ember glowing faintly in the dim. Their Versailles boots crunched on the ice as they made a slow circuit of the perimeter. Guards. Ethan pressed his back against the boulder, pulling Grace with him. His pulse hammered, but Shadow's growl grew louder, the shepherd's hackles raised despite his weakened state. When the men drew closer, one of them paused, narrowing his eyes as if sensing something in the dark. He shifted his rifle. Before Ethan could move, Shadow lunged forward with a sudden burst of strength, teeth flashing, growl ripping into the stillness. The guard shouted, rifles swinging, and the forest erupted into chaos. Ethan surged forward, weapon raised, his voice hard and commanding. Grace gasped, but did not retreat, clutching a length of fallen branch like a weapon of her own. Even half-starved, scarred, and battered, Shadow hurled himself into the fight with the heart of a warrior unbroken. The crack of rifles shattered the stillness of the pine forest, echoing against the snow-laden trunks. Ethan Brooks dove to the side, dragging Grace with him, his boots skidding across the ice-crusted ground. Shadow, gaunt and scarred, but driven by a will that refused to die, lunged toward the nearest guard. The shepherd's growl ripped through the night as his teeth sank into the padded sleeve of the taller man's coat. The man, a burly figure with a thick beard and shoulders as broad as an ox, howled in pain, swinging his rifle wildly, but Shadow clung on, refusing to yield. The second guard, shorter and stockier, spat out his cigarette and leveled his weapon. His round face glistened with sweat despite the cold, eyes narrow with cruelty. Ethan's pistol barked once, the bullet splintering the stock of the man's rifle and sending it clattering to the snow. The guard cursed, retreating, his stubby hands fumbling for a knife strapped to his belt. "Grace, inside!" Ethan shouted, his voice sharpened by urgency. But Grace, auburn hair loose around her pale face, did not run. Her hazel eyes blazed with defiance as she hefted the fallen branch she had carried since the tree line. When the shorter guard lunged, she swung with all her strength, the wood cracking against his jaw. He staggered, clutching his face, blood bright against the snow. From inside the crooked cabin, more shadows spilled out. 2 men, then 3, each armed with pipes, chains, or crude weapons. At their center came a figure that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Reed Lawson. Lawson had once been a fisherman, a man known in Marquette for his booming laugh and red beard, for his easy camaraderie in the taverns. But years of debt, alcohol, and bitterness had twisted him into something darker. Now, in his early 40s, his thick frame had gone to fat, his ruddy face blotched with drink, but his eyes, cold and sharp, burned with calculation. A jagged scar slashed across his cheek, the souvenir of a bar fight that had ended his reputation as a good man. Lawson had turned his knowledge of the lake and its forgotten cabins into a cover for crime. Smuggling, trapping, and now the trafficking of dogs. "Well, look what crawled out of the fog," Lawson sneered, his voice carrying mockery. "The sheriff's boy, still chasing ghosts." His gaze flicked to Shadow, who still had his teeth buried in the guard's coat. And the mutt that should have drowned years ago. Ethan's jaw clenched. "You're finished, Lawson." Lawson laughed, the sound coarse and bitter. "Finished? No. You think one half-starved dog and a bleeding heart vet will stop me?" He gestured to the cages inside the cabin, where dozens of dogs whimpered and barked, their cries shredding the silence. "These beasts are worth more than gold. People pay for power, for bloodlines, for fights. And I provide." Shadow released his grip and staggered back, ribs heaving, but his stance was unbroken. His ears flattened, lips peeled back in defiance. Grace knelt quickly, steadying the shepherd with a hand. Ethan stepped forward, gun steady, storm-gray eyes locked on Lawson. The standoff erupted when the shorter guard recovered and charged. Ethan fired, grazing the man's leg and dropping him to the snow. Grace swung again, her branch shattering against another thug's arm. Shadow lunged, teeth flashing, dragging down the larger man with the beard. The forest roared with chaos, men shouting, dogs barking, and the crunch of combat on frozen earth. Then, the sirens. Red and blue lights pierced the mist, tires crunching on snow. Sheriff Briggs arrived with 3 cruisers, doors slamming as deputies poured into the clearing. Briggs himself, a grizzled man in his 50s with a hawk-like nose and thinning blonde hair, lifted his shotgun with a steady hand. His reputation was of a man fair but unyielding, molded by decades of law and hardened by the loss of his own son to a drunk driver. That grief had made him merciless toward cruelty. "Drop your weapons!" Briggs thundered, his voice cutting through the bedlam. The remaining thugs froze, realizing the fight was lost. Lawson snarled, his scarred face contorting with rage, but even he lowered his weapon under the unwavering aim of a dozen rifles. Deputies swarmed the cabin, prying open the cages as dogs spilled out, tails wagging, voices rising in a desperate, jubilant chorus. Grace's eyes filled as she watched the rescued animals, her hand still resting on Shadow's back. Ethan lowered his pistol only when Lawson was cuffed and dragged away, cursing into the snow. Briggs glanced at Ethan, his weathered face softening just slightly. "You did good," he said, voice low. Ethan shook his head. His eyes were on Shadow, who stood trembling but unbowed, amber eyes bright despite exhaustion. "He did better," Ethan murmured. Hours later, back in town, the news spread quickly. The dogs had been saved, the traffickers dismantled, and the German shepherd thought dead had returned like a ghost made flesh. At the Pine Harbor Clinic, townsfolk gathered to glimpse the survivors. Children pressed their hands against the glass, watching as volunteers comforted the frightened dogs. In the center of it all lay Shadow, bandaged and frail but proud, his head lifted high. To the townspeople, he became more than a dog. He was a symbol, proof that endurance could outlast cruelty, that loyalty could weather years of silence. For Ethan, the weight that had chained his soul since that night of fire finally loosened. Beside him stood Grace, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light, her smile tentative but real. Shadow rested at his feet, scars visible but spirit unbroken. For the first time in years, Ethan felt whole. And as the snow melted from the eaves and the bells of the church tolled softly in the distance, he realized that sometimes miracles came not in thunder or fire, but in the quiet return of what you thought was gone forever. Sometimes miracles do not come with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the loyalty of a dog who refuses to give up, in the courage of a man who learns to hope again, or in the compassion of people who choose to stand together against cruelty. Shadow's return was not only a story of survival, it was a sign that love never truly dies, that God can take even the darkest scars and turn them into a new beginning. And just like Ethan and Shadow, we all face storms in our lives. There are days when the weight feels too heavy, when loss seems final. But God whispers to us through small wonders, a helping hand, a kind word, the loyal eyes of a friend, reminding us that hope is never gone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel so together we can spread stories of faith, loyalty, and redemption. May God bless you and your loved ones, giving you strength in hard times, peace in your homes, and the courage to see the miracles He places in your path every single day. Amen.